New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want New America would like to welcome you to our virtual event. The program will begin momentarily. While we are waiting, I want to review a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and a recording will be posted to the New America events page within 48 hours after the event. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and you will not be able to be seen or heard by your fellow attendees or panelists. Therefore, we encourage you to share your comments and questions in the Q&A features, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for joining us. We will begin momentarily.
Thank you everyone for joining us. A few additional housekeeping notes. Should you have any questions, you can go ahead and tweet at OTI to submit those questions or comments. And if you are joining us via YouTube, you can share your questions and comments in the chat. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Spandy.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Spandy Singh and I've been spearheading OTI's work related to algorithmic fairness, accountability, and transparency. Over the past year, OTI has published a series of 4 reports which look at how internet platforms use algorithmic decision-making for a range of purposes, including content moderation, the ranking of content in search results and newsfeed, ad targeting and delivery, and when making recommendations to users. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by a great lineup of panelists to discuss the subject of our 3rd report, which is how we can promote greater fairness, accountability, and transparency around the use of algorithmic decision-making in ad targeting and delivery systems. We will have some time at the end for our panelists to answer questions. So if you have any questions, please use the question and answer functions and we will do our best to get back to you. So now I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Joe Westby, who is a researcher on technology and human rights at Amnesty International in the United Kingdom, where he focuses on the human rights implications of big data, AI, and the power of tech. He is currently leading Amnesty's emerging program of work tracking the systemic threat to human rights posed by the surveillance-based business model underpinning the internet. Next, we have Lindsay Kerr, who is a Democratic staff director and chief counsel on the Senate Rules Committee under ranking member Amy Klobuchar. She works on a broad portfolio of issues related to campaign finance, election law, and national security. Next, we have Morgan Williams, who is general counsel at the National Fair Housing Alliance, where he is responsible for leading the office's strategic and tactical legal initiatives and affairs, and where he directs NFHA's efforts to pursue pioneering litigation under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And last but not least, we have Natalie Marshall, who is a senior policy analyst at Ranking Digital Rights, where she leads RDR's policy engagement and policy development efforts. Natalie led the expansion of RDR's Corporate Accountability Index's methodology to address human rights risks associated with tech companies' business models, with a particular emphasis on the role of targeted advertising in algorithmic systems. So thank you all for joining us. I wanted to first kick it off with a question for Joe. So in one of your latest reports titled Surveillance Giants, How the Business Model of Google and Facebook Threatens Human Rights, you've outlined how control over our digital lives is one of the primary human rights challenges today, and it is something that we would never tolerate from a government. Can you talk a little bit about how we got here, especially with regard to the use of algorithms in targeted advertising?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. So yeah, we looked at the business model that underpins the data economy, what some have called the original sin of the internet, which is, of course, the tech companies drive profit by knowing more and more about our digital lives in order to sell more finely targeted ads. And I think it's now widely recognized this model is broken. We analyzed it from a human rights perspective, and we argue that this business model is, because it is predicated on surveillance, ubiquitous and invasive surveillance of people's digital lives, it is a threat to human rights on a vast global scale, really affecting billions of people. And the rights that we're talking about here is, of course, privacy. Insofar as this business model is really the opposite of privacy. It relies on knowing more or less everything about you when you operate in the digital world, and using that to target you with ads. But there's also this now knock-on effects that have been widely documented on a whole range of other human rights, including non-discrimination, freedom of expression, even freedom of thought. And this is all linked to the ways that tech companies have the power to kind of shape and control our information environment and influence our thoughts and behaviors through the use of this model on their platforms. And we, I think we're now seeing these examples of the harms and the kind of knock-on effects over and over again. Micro-targeting of opaque political messaging in elections, amplifying hate speech, in some cases leading to actual violence, enabling discriminatory ad targeting, and illegally targeting children and collecting their personal information. This is all kind of comes back to the same problem with the ad-driven business model underpinning these platforms. We focused in particular on Google and Facebook, not just as pioneers of the model, but because of their dominance over not only digital advertising, but over the global public square, the kind of channels that we rely on in the modern world to engage with everything in the digital world, search, social media, messaging, video, smartphones, and this goes hand in hand with the business model. It has the business model has both enabled these companies to grow and obtain this dominant position, and also it exacerbates and amplifies the harms that we're seeing. So, I think to your question, actually, just if I may really briefly on the question of kind of how we got there, I think it's really important to look back at how this has evolved over the past 2 decades, because we've got to the point where we just accept that this is the way the internet works. But we need to remember that firstly, the internet wasn't always reliant on this business model, and there are alternatives. And secondly, that the problems that we're seeing now are entirely predictable. Almost 2 decades ago, the privacy campaign group EPIC spoke at the Senate, warning of the long-term implications of profile-based advertising and the need for strong privacy laws. And the fact that those warnings weren't heeded is why we are where we are now, and that the self-regulation has failed. And really, we need to now look at how we go kind of changing this business model and putting in place stronger oversight over the ad targeting algorithms, ad targeting delivery algorithms underpinning these platforms.
Thanks, Joe. Next, I want to turn to Natalie. Natalie, in your recent report series, you talk significantly about the influence targeted advertising can and has had, exemplified through, for example, Russian interference, radicalization, and misleading advertising. Talk about what specifically makes these algorithmic ad systems so powerful, and why our focus needs to be on the business models of these internet platforms rather than just the content.
Thanks, Bandy, and thanks so much for having me. So I want to start by elaborating a bit on what Joe said about how the how the targeted advertising business model influences the way that the rest of the platform, the part that that makes users flock to the platforms, because I'm very sorry, platforms, but nobody's coming to your platforms for the purpose of finding targeted advertising. That's just something that we kind of have to sit through to get to posts from our friends and family. And whatever else we want to engage with there. In order to deliver targeted advertising and to make a lot of money from it, you need two things. You need a lot of data about your users, both who they are and what they do. And two, you need your users to spend as much time as possible so you have as much eyeball space, so to speak, to rent out or sell to your advertisers. So that creates a set of powerful incentives that have led the social platforms that we know and love, or love to hate, or hate to love, perhaps, and how we engage with them. So I think most of us by now are pretty familiar with the idea that engagement, meaning how much eyeball time is spent on platform, how much you click, how much you read, is used as the metric that companies use to determine how much ad space they have to sell in a way. And so everything about how the platforms work is designed to drive engagement. So that's why platforms want to show you content that they think you're more likely to click on, more likely to read, more likely to have an emotional response to. And those are things that can be measured by computers. On the other hand, there's a whole lot of other things that I would argue are much more important that can't be measured by computers. So how true, how factually accurate something is, how beneficial to society something is, whether something is a public service message, perhaps about public health, or if something is, I don't know, sports score, or the latest celebrity cheating scandal, right? A computer cannot tell the difference between these things. That's something that requires human judgment. Because companies aspire to operate at massive scale, they have to rely on this kind of automation, which means that not only that the things that can be measured, again, by machines, end up being the things that count. And the things that, again, I would argue truly count, don't get measured and are at best afterthoughts in the calculation of what content gets amplified and gets shown the most. At worst, gets dismissed as something that's entirely subjective and therefore not real and therefore not true, right? And that's where you get the discourse around companies not wanting to be the arbiter of truth. It's not because it's not possible to discern truth. In many cases, there is a difference between actual facts and complete nonsense, right? But it's not something that can be easily discerned by machines, or sometimes not discernible by machines at all. The second bit, and this is where the data part comes in, is that in order to charge the highest rates you can, as a company, you need to be able to tell your advertisers that you have access to many more eyeballs than anybody else. So there again is where the scope and the reach comes in, right? And the need to rely on automation. And you also want to be able to tell them that you have the best data to help them reach exactly who it is that they want to reach with their message. There's an old saying from the Madison Avenue heydays of advertising, that half of all advertising money is wasted. The problem is that you don't know which half. The promise of targeted advertising is to allow advertisers to know exactly which half is being wasted, so that you're only showing detergent ads to people who actually buy detergent, as opposed to the members of the household who have nothing to do with detergent purchases. That you only show your political ads to people who are registered voters in the correct jurisdiction, and who are either persuadable or likely to turn out for your party, but you need likely to vote for your party, but you need to motivate them to actually take the step towards voting. So what's the downside of all this? Well, the downside of all that is that, first of all, much of this data, and I would argue most of this data, is collected in illegitimate ways, either because people don't know that the data is being collected, that it's being collected in a coercive manner, that you can only use the service that you need in order to participate in society by allowing this data to be collected about you, or it's then used for purposes that are not the purposes that you agreed to. So one example would be when you give your cell phone number to a platform to use for two-factor authentication, which is a way of adding another measure of security to make sure that people who are not you can't hack into your account. And then that cell phone number is used for your advertising profile, or is sold to a host of shady actors who then use them to call you and try to sell you things, or for robocalls. That's a breach of the, maybe not in the legal sense a breach of contract, but certainly in the moral sense. And so because so much of this data is acquired in an illegitimate way, that means that anything that you do with it is fruit of the poisonous tree, to use a legal framing. So it's illegitimate. But then in addition to that, and that I think should be reason enough in my view. But as Joe was saying, in addition to that, it leads to discrimination harms, and that's something that Morgan will talk a lot about, I'm sure, in the context of his organization's lawsuit and the settlement, but I won't spend too much time on that. But it also leads to violations to freedom of speech, to access to information, and to freedom of thought, as Joe said. So I think we have to think about what the not just the specific harms that come from the advertising. They are real, and Morgan's going to talk about that. But we also need to consider the impact, the set of incentives that creates, and how that leads companies to create content curation algorithms, the ones that decide which of the many posts you could be seeing, you end up seeing, and in what order, and how that in turn impacts the way that you perceive the world, and the way that you operate within it.
Thanks, Natalie. Lindsay, I wanted to turn it to you now. Since the 2016 US presidential elections, in which we saw foreign actors influencing the elections through the use of social media platforms and their targeted ad systems, Senator Klobuchar, who you work for, has been a fierce proponent of expanding disclosure requirements for political ads online. Could you talk about the Honest Ads Act, which has been the main vehicle for these efforts, and how it strives to encourage greater transparency and accountability from platforms?
Sure. Thank you, Spandy and OTI, and for all the other panelists for hosting me today and for participating. As you mentioned, Senator Klobuchar is the top Democrat on the Senate Rules Committee, which has jurisdiction over federal elections. And she joined the committee not long after the 2016 election, where we know Russia so brazenly interfered in our democracy. And so the top priority for Senator Klobuchar, since she's joined the committee, is to secure our elections and to stop or combat the spread of disinformation online. And out of the gates, we had hearings after 2016 about exactly what the Russians did. And one of the things that I think outraged people so much was that we know that Russian operatives bought ads on Facebook with rubles. And so we got to work very quickly after learning that to find ways that we could build more transparency and accountability on online platforms, specifically related to online political ads. And one of the things that we came up with was the Honest Ads Act, which is a very simple piece of legislation that says if you sell political ads online, whether they be candidate ads where you're advocating for or against someone's election, or an issue ad, which is really important because we know that foreign actors use issue ads to sow discord and division a lot, and they target those ads specifically. I think in 2016, the Senate Intelligence Committee said that African Americans were the most targeted group in terms of disinformation from foreign adversaries. So the issue ads is a really critical piece of that. So if you're selling issue ads on your platform or political ads, those ads have to have very clear disclaimers on them about who pays for them, and you have to have a file. You disclose the ads where the public, academics, journalists can go and easily access those ads in a library. That is consistent with what the laws that we have on the books now for ads that are sold on TV, radio, and in print. And when those laws were written, the proliferation of online ads wasn't really contemplated. And so our technology has, taken off in terms of the number of ads that are sold online, billions and billions of dollars. And our laws have not caught up. And so the Honest Ads Act puts online political ads in the same footing as other ads. It's a really simple bill. It has bipartisan support. So when we first introduced it in 2017, right after the election, the late Senator McCain was our lead Republican on the bill, which made sense because he was, the architect of McCain-Feingold, the campaign finance bill, and was very passionate about disclosure and disclaimers for campaign ads. And Senator Warner is our Democratic partner. He's the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So he understands probably more than anyone what exactly foreign adversaries are doing, how they're using these platforms and manipulating them to undermine our democracy. And when we reintroduced it again this year, Chairman Graham, who's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is the chief Republican sponsor of the bill. And I think, most people, when you tell them what the bill does, it seems like common sense. I think if you were to put it on the Senate floor today, it would pass. It's already passed the House. The Republican leader doesn't support the legislation, so that's our roadblock. But it's a really simple piece of legislation. And now with what we're seeing, just the sort of the manipulation and the craziness that we're seeing online, I think a lot of people would say that the Honest Ads Act is an absolute basic necessity and something that we should build off of in terms of transparency and accountability for online advertising. And I'll say, when we introduced the legislation, we did work closely with some of the biggest platforms to see, how it could work. And to Natalie's point, because a lot of ad sales, all the ad sales are done without human interaction, it is difficult. And the platforms initially said, we don't think this is, at least entirely something that we can implement. And they quickly realized that they could. And platforms like Facebook and Twitter have begun voluntarily implementing the Honest Ads Act. So they do have disclaimers. There is an ad library. None of it is perfect. It's not, complete. It's not complete implementation. And from Ranking Member Klobuchar's perspective, I think what she would say is, it's great that they're voluntarily doing this. It is absolutely not a substitute for passing the bill. And we cannot trust these companies to self-police. And I think that's really, really self-evident. So I'll stop there in terms of explaining what the bill does.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Morgan, I'd like to turn it to you next. So in March 2018, NFHA and 3 of its member organizations filed a lawsuit against Facebook, alleging that the company's ad platform enables landlords and real estate brokers to exclude people of color, women, people with disabilities, and other protected groups from receiving housing ads. The lawsuit resulted in a settlement that drove a number of changes across the company's ad platform. Could you talk about the scope of the lawsuit and what kinds of changes it resulted in?
Sure, and thank you so much for the chance to be here. The National Fair Housing Alliance is a national office that works to ensure compliance with the Fair Housing Act. It's based in DC, but it has a network of local offices that are our membership across the country, local fair housing centers. And it's with 3 of these offices that we carried out an investigation of Facebook's ad platform and ultimately pursued federal litigation in the Southern District of New York and in regards to the alleged discriminatory conduct of the platform's operations in the algorithms that manifest the targeted categories that were used in the ads targeting features, as well as other concerns associated with the operation and the ad and its delivery functions. In short, in November of 2016, ProPublica ran an article featuring Facebook's ad platforms and the extent to which you can target those ads based on ethnic affinity. And essentially, that was a term that Facebook advertisers use to refer to race and racial targeting of advertisements. And so there was a significant outcry as a function of this. We heard from our members across the country, from our federal legislative partners with regards to concern over this, and immediately reached out to Facebook in a letter noting concern over what was identified in the publication and what we had identified in some preliminary investigative work as a function of the outcry. Facebook was responsive and asserted that they would be changing their operations. We met with them several times in the following weeks, and that February of 2017, they issued notice that they were changing their platform to remove these discriminatory features in their targeting operations. The following fall, ProPublic ran a second story that showed that Facebook had not, in fact, changed its operations, and that the same ads that ProPublic had ran before, they were able to run. And at that point, we shifted our gear from shifted our focus from advocacy with Facebook to enforcement-oriented investigation under the Fair Housing Act. There's very strong organizational standing, or the ability for private fair housing offices to pursue investigations and enforcement of discriminatory conduct in the housing market. And the Fair Housing Act is very clear that it's illegal to express a discriminatory preference in advertising, and it's not only illegal for housing providers or housing service providers to do so, but for publishers themselves to publish those discriminatory ads. And so there's a long history of enforcement against publications. NAFA, in fact, in 2009, brought a lawsuit against American Classifieds, the largest classified advertisement company in the country at the time, for both print and online ads. And we were involved in amicus engagement in the 2009 litigation in both the Craigslist.com Seventh Circuit decisions and the Roommates.com Ninth Circuit decisions, the first set of Ninth Circuit decisions that went before the Ninth Circuit in that case, and dealing with the issues of the scope of the Communications Decency Act immunity to housing discrimination claims in those cases and in subsequent cases. And we then and since have long adhered to the principle that the Fair Housing Act should not be relegated to print advertising and should apply online just as it does to print advertising, and that the immunity of the Communications Decency Act should not apply to housing discrimination. And in fact, in our litigation against Facebook, in the motion to dismiss briefing that was filed, they asserted Communications Decency Act defenses, and we briefed our responses to that. Notably, the Department of Justice filed a statement of interest or amicus brief in support of our arguments around the application of Communications Decency Act immunity and the application of the Fair Housing Act to Facebook's operations. Because we settled that legal decision was not rendered on those open questions, but there is currently other briefing that's pending in other litigation in which Facebook has similarly asserted this defense, in which there may be further case law on this question. In any case, we did reach a settlement with Facebook in which, in partnership with a couple of other pieces of pending litigation involving the employment sector in particular, in which Facebook agreed to change their housing ad platform to preclude ads that are in regards to housing, credit, or employment services, to not allow those advertisements to engage Facebook's targeting ad platform in a number of notable ways. One, it drastically limits the targeting features to a set of targeting options that were jointly agreed upon by the plaintiffs and Facebook. Two, it restricts a lot of the targeting features around geography and other things that you could use to engage in discriminatory, segregating advertising practices. And three, it limits what was referred to as Facebook's lookalike feature to a now reconstituted special ad audience, which removes a lot of the filtering features on Facebook's ad platform tool that allows advertisers to target an existing customer base or identified pool of individuals. We still have outstanding concerns about the reconstituted special ad audience to the extent that it's limited to targeting users on the basis of like internet usage. And we think that there's probably a lot of instances in which that's problematic. And under the settlement, Facebook has specifically agreed to study that operation and the discriminatory effects of that operation and confer with us about further changes to that part of the platform. It's noteworthy, and I'll stop here. Definitely ramble on further about this, and really would welcome any questions in particular coming out from listening to the roundtable discussion that preceded this. It's very compelling and some noteworthy, I think, relevance to some of the work in this case. But we'll just add that there's a HUD investigation that was reopened in part as a function of the lawsuit that we had filed, but was a secretary-initiated complaint that HUD issued a charge on in March of 2019, shortly after we announced the settlement of our lawsuit, which referred the matter to the Department of Justice for enforcement. And in considering kind of outstanding concerns around Facebook's operation, I would say that they're principally twofold. One is in regards to the potentially discriminatory function of their special ad audience feature as it's been reconstituted. And two is in some of the research that's been published more recently since our settlement on the delivery function of Facebook's ad platform and the extent to which, separate apart from the ad campaign that is programmed into what is launched into Facebook's ad platform, that the algorithm that Facebook uses to sort how those different campaigns are prioritized and delivered to viewers potentially skews results in a discriminatory way, and there's outstanding concern about that. The Department of Justice has not filed suit, so ostensibly it's likely that they're in some form of settlement negotiations, and it may be that they're focused on these two outstanding issues that are subject of concern.
Thanks, Morgan. So now I would like to open some questions up for the panel as a whole. So as we've discussed, the use of algorithms for ad targeting and delivery purposes can perpetuate harmful outcomes, biases, and discrimination. What kind of mechanisms can be leveraged to reduce the instances of such harmful outcomes and promote greater transparency and accountability around the instances that do take place? Some examples that I know we've all discussed and mentioned in some of our reports are algorithmic audits and impact assessments. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And maybe first I'll turn it over to Natalie.
Thanks, Bandy. So I think there's three main areas of intervention that I think are particularly fruitful for the U.S. Congress to pursue. The first one is mandatory transparency that I think can and probably should start with the Honest Ads Act, but going beyond that to apply to not just political ads, but other types of ads in general. And because I think if among the many lessons we've learned over the past 6 months of life in the time of coronavirus is that political ads is not the only place that harmful disinformation can circulate, right? So that's the first place, but also looking at transparency around how all content, both paid content like advertising and user-generated content, is governed on the internet. This is very different from having the government set the rules, right? That is not an appropriate thing for the U.S. government to do, and that in fact would be contrary to the First Amendment. But I think it is appropriate for the government to require certain measures of transparency about what the rules are, how they're enforced, what the appeals process is, because there should be an appeals process, because no company is going to get it right every single time, right? That's not what we should aspire to. We should aspire to having a functional appeals process, and then publish numbers about the outcomes, how much content is taken down, what type of content, through what mechanism, etc. The second place where I think, and that I think is going to be the most, possibly both the most difficult to negotiate, but also the most impactful, is federal privacy legislation. You know, there's been a lot of talk recently in Washington, and is likely to continue to be, about reforming or possibly even eliminating the Communications Decency Act. I'm very sympathetic and agree with most of the goals that are being pursued through this avenue, but I just don't think that intermediary liability is the way to get to that. Perhaps clarifying that what was and was not the original intent of the CDA, because there is a growing legal consensus that many of the court decisions that Morgan referred to were decided in ways that were just not consistent with what the CDA was actually meant to do. I think that's something that's worth talking about, but I think more importantly than that, the way to prevent these harms from happening is through privacy legislation. We have a framework in our latest report series. I'm not sure whether we're able to share the link through a chat here within Zoom or not, but if not, I'll certainly be tweeting it out. That outlines what we think a federal privacy legislation should focus on, so that the types of harmful discrimination and illegitimate data collection that we've been talking about can't take place. And then the third piece, which I think is probably the wonkiest and perhaps least sexy to talk about, has to do with corporate governance reform. So that has to do with how companies govern themselves. There's been a lot of talk about how the CEOs of Facebook and Google in particular have these dual roles of being both CEO of the company and chairman of the board of directors. And on top of that, thanks to a dual class share structure that's very popular in the tech sector, they control more votes than anybody else, which puts them in a position of essentially being dictators of their companies and are completely immune from the type of oversight that a board of directors or the fact that they have shareholders, right, and are a publicly traded company is meant to do. So I think there's a lot of innovation to have there. There are actions that entities that are not the U.S. Congress should be pursuing. I think antitrust is, and I know that there's been a House Judiciary hearing just announced for later this month that we'll focus on. But that's something that I think at this point is mostly out of the hands of Congress and in the hands of antitrust regulators. So I think those are but it is indeed worth pursuing just on a separate track from the legislative options that I just mentioned.
Thanks, Natalie. And would any of our other panelists like to jump in?
Yeah, hi.
Go ahead, Joe.
Let's go with Joe first.
Sorry. Okay, thanks. I'll just be very brief. Just certainly we welcome all of the recommendations that Natalie has just outlined. Just building on that for a couple of others from our point of view. I mean, I think going back to this point around platform power and the dominance of a handful of tech platforms, I think really we need measures that will tackle that and encourage a more kind of pluralistic internet. So antitrust could potentially be one of the tools in the arsenal of states and regulators. Interoperability as well, I think, is an important technical standard which should be much more greatly enforced to enable other platforms to develop. And then I think one other thing which we think is really high priority is really to make it new legally binding protections to stop platforms from forcing users to accept this surveillance-based business model, because currently how what we see is that the effectively users have no choice but to sign up to this kind of invasive profiling and targeting in order to use services which everybody now relies on. And so really you have a false choice where either you don't benefit from the modern world and the digital world, or you consent to this model which is abusive of human rights. And so I think that kind of needs to be a first step that government should look at insofar as people should have the choice to opt out meaningfully from these kind of practices.
Thanks, Joe. And Morgan, just before I turn it over to you, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that if you would like to ask a question, to use the Q&A function. And now, Morgan, on to you.
Thanks. Just a brief comment in regards to the question about tools for accountability and transparency in terms of civil rights enforcement and accountability for civil rights protections. One of the most important tools that we have at our disposal is disparate impact liability, which is separate and apart from intentional discrimination claims, but involve claims in which a policy that's neutral or non-discriminatory on its face, when put into practice, has a discriminatory outcome. And that can be a very powerful tool when talking about algorithmic operations. And unfortunately, well, that's a very powerful tool that's at our disposal. HUD in 2013 issued a rule that provides a lot of common understanding for what a standard of disparate impact liability should be, unifying a lot of the different circuit analysis that is out there. And in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in Texas Department of Community Affairs, Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project that upheld disparate impact liability under the Fair Housing Act. And it's actually on the basis of this Supreme Court decision that the current administration is actually proposing a new disparate impact rule that would completely upend the ability to bring disparate impact cases, and in particular has a specific defense regarding any practices that are associated with algorithmic operations in which the inputs used in the algorithmic model are not themselves substitutes or close proxies for protected characteristics, and the model is predictive of risk or some other objective. And anyone who knows algorithmic models knows that that's an absurd defense, because it's not individual inputs that contribute to the output of an algorithmic model, but the relationship between different inputs. And so such a defense really would provide a kind of safe harbor immunity for any practices that are based on algorithms. This is a proposed rule that HUD accepted comments on this past fall, and that a number of folks in the tech civil rights world were very responsive to, and really appreciate everyone's engagement on that in partnership with the fair housing and broader civil rights world. HUD sent a proposed final rule to OIRA, the agency responsible for securing final interagency review of that final rule, in early May 7th, and is poised to issue that final rule any day now. So please be on the lookout. I think if you are interested in engaging in advocacy on this issue, there's the opportunity to actually schedule meetings with OIRA, the agency that's coordinating that interagency review, and confer with them about your concerns about at least what was in the proposed rule. We don't know what's in the proposed final rule now. But additionally, we'll be looking to challenge that final rule on the basis of potential Administrative Procedure Act claims, and there may be avenues for some folks in this space to be, potential litigants in challenging provisions specifically that deal with algorithms. Additionally, we'll be working with any future administrations to rescind these terrible new standards that are being put out there to roll back civil rights protections in this space.
Thanks, Morgan. Lindsay, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I mean, the thing I'd say is to...
And sorry, Lindsay, would you mind coming a little closer to your screen? It's hard to hear you.
Sure. Is that better?
It's a little better, yes. Thank you.
I think one of the things that Natalie said, she talked about Section 230 reform, and that's something that is being discussed heavily in the halls of Congress right now. I think that there are multiple senators on both sides of the aisle who are very interested, and you're seeing sort of different bipartisan bills crop up. I think conservatives are motivated by the myth that the algorithms are biased against them. And I think that on the Democratic side, we're motivated for all the reasons that we're discussing here right now. And, you know, I think that's something you're going to see more of. I know Vice President Biden has made it clear he supports security reform, and many others. I'll also say, you know, I think when we have regulators like the FTC issuing fines for wrongdoing and lawlessness on behalf of some of the platforms, like just a year ago, we had the FTC decision about Cambridge Analytica and the $5 billion fine, which is the biggest fine ever. But you know, when you make $55 billion a year, it's nothing. So I think having having regulators really, you know, put some teeth behind some of the fines and the punishments would go a long way as well.
Thanks. So I'm going to turn it now to audience questions. The first one, what should multi-stakeholder collaborations around promoting accountability around digital advertising algorithms look like? In particular, how can industry, government, civil society, and civil rights groups better engage? And what are like the main challenges that you see in trying to push this kind of work forward? Maybe I can turn it to Joe first, if you want to take that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that there is a lot that can be done in the short term through kind of multi-stakeholder collaborations. I mean, I think following the previous question, ultimately this is going to require state-based regulation and binding laws. Self-regulation has failed. But I think at least in the short term, there are discussions that can be had between affected kind of communities or representatives of affected communities and the big platforms in order to put in place better kind of systems and mitigation measures that the companies can adopt. I mean, actually, I think that I know it's the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which is obviously very live at the moment. You know, I think that's a good example of, you know, there's a lot of issues there which overlap with what we're discussing and which really like tie back to the problems of the business model. And there's some really concrete recommendations that the campaign has, like putting in place a C-suite executive with civil rights expertise in Facebook. And I think those kind of steps would be really important and really impactful until we can put in place these longer term laws and regulations that actually protect people kind of across the board.
Thanks, Joe. Natalie?
Yeah, so I think there's been an evolution of the civil society and multi-stakeholder discourse around platform accountability. I think the early years of social media platforms in general were filled with a lot of optimism around the positives that these new tools could bring for activism, for social movements, and more. Starting around the middle of the past decade, I think there was a growing realization of the harms that could come to movements and to activists and others from relying so much on these platforms, and what happens when an activist content gets taken down, and how can you get it restored, and how can you appeal, and so on. And then I think after the year 2016 was a big wake-up call, certainly for social movements in the West, with the twin tragedies of Brexit and the 2016 U.S. election. And yes, I do view both of those events as tragedies. because they were just such clear self-owns by two of the world's most powerful democracies. But I think since then we've all collectively spent a lot of time reflecting and analyzing and looking at data to better understand exactly what happened. And I think that understanding exists there now. It's disputed, to be sure, but I think we do have a solid collective understanding of what happened. And now I think now that what's happening is the building of a consensus around what needs to be done. And I am encouraged by the progress that's been happening over the past few years. The understanding that platforms have too much power and that they're unaccountable. And now the debate that I see happening is on exactly what the tactics are for getting there. I do think there's a shared vision for what the outcome needs to be, right? A technology sector that is more responsive to democratic oversight, to human rights, to the needs and interests of the public, and not just to their own bottom lines and their shareholders' pockets. But now we're talking about what tactics will be needed to get there, and I, for one, am hopeful that that's a conversation that's going to mature very quickly, especially if new channels for activism emerge after the 2020 election here in the U.S.
Thanks, Natalie. Morgan or Lindsay, would you like to jump in? Okay. So the next question we have is for Morgan. How do you think lawsuits such as the one that NFHA helped lead can play a role in promoting greater accountability around the use of these algorithmic systems? And what are some of the key lessons that were learned in the process?
Yeah, well, I think lawsuits can play a very important role in changing the practice of individual operators, but also in informing the market more broadly about where prospective liability may lie. Just recently, HUD announced some changes that Google was making to its platform in regards to its targeting features in the housing space, and in particular around the use of zip code and other geographic targeting features as they may be used in the housing sector. And that kind of enforcement can help to educate the market about the scope of that kind of liability. I mean, additionally, there are open questions about the scope of the relationship between the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Communications Decency Act. And those questions, may be decided in some fashion through legislative means down the road, but they are open questions that, may be decided in the courts in future litigation. And though our case settled and those legal questions were left open, there are other cases that remain and other litigation that, we may pursue against other parties that may help to sort of clarify some of those legal questions in ways that we think would expand the scope of civil rights protections in this space.
Thanks, Morgan. The next question is for the panel as a whole. So we've talked about forms of legislation such as the Honest Ads Act, which is an example of policymaker action that tries to promote greater transparency around online advertising. There have also been other bills that have been introduced, and as Natalie mentioned, some of them have raised some First Amendment concerns because they try to direct how platforms regulate their content. So would love to get everyone's thoughts on what should policymaker action look like in this space? Do you think that sort of the bills that have been put forth go far enough? Do you think they need to go farther? And maybe first I can either turn it over to Lindsay or Natalie.
I'm having a little bit of trouble with my mic. I hope you guys can hear me okay. I think, like I said at the beginning, I think Honest Ads is sort of a no-brainer when it comes to the most basic things that we should be doing for political ad transparency, and to Natalie's point, for all ad transparency. I think that it's really clear that the platforms are being manipulated in a way that is making it difficult for people to know what the truth is. I think if you talk to friends who you may disagree with, that becomes even more and more clear. But I think it is a place to build from. And I'll also just say, I mentioned that if it was on the Senate floor today, it would pass. Sometimes my boss goes to the floor and does a procedural thing called a live UC, which is where she asks the Senate to pass the bill immediately, and it would pass unless someone objects. And this is just really to sort of highlight the need for the legislation, because we know that there will be a Republican objector. And whenever we choose honest ad with the bill to live UC to highlight the need to focus on the issues that we're talking about right now, we get the very clear sense from Republicans that they don't like objecting to it. And I think that's because they know, at least ones that we talked to about it, that this legislation is necessary. So it's a starting point. But like I said, I really think that there is bipartisan consensus that, more must be done. And right now, the focus on what that is really surrounding Section 230 reform and liability.
Thanks, Lindsay. Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just briefly repeat what I said earlier, which is that I think first we need transparency about how content is governed online, both paid and unpaid content. And the Honest Ads Act is, like Lindsay said, a no-brainer place to start. It's unfortunate that there's a one-man obstacle in the way of getting that bill passed, but it is what it is, at least for now. The second thing, and I think, again, the most impactful thing by far will be to pass strong privacy legislation at the federal level. And I think one of the goals of that should be to make the types of discriminatory targeting and the disparate impact that Morgan talked about be as close to impossible to enact as can be done. And here again, I'll point people to the Ranking Digital Rights Report, which I think the OTI account graciously tweeted out the link to for details on that. And then the third bit is reforming corporate governance, so that companies themselves have to be accountable not only to democratic oversight, but also to their boards of directors and to their shareholders. I think once those things are in place, I think at that point it will make more sense to look at Section 230. There's some interesting proposals out there. So I mentioned clarifying what the original intent was, and certainly clarifying that disparate impact liability laws, that the CDA should not be a shield from that. That's something that I think there's very sound legal arguments for. Public knowledge also has a very interesting proposal out to carve out advertising specifically from CDA protection, and I think that's worth discussing. But again, I think it's going to be much more impactful to focus on transparency, privacy, and corporate governance reform first, especially since those three avenues don't have the risk to freedom of expression that intermediary liability does.
Thanks, Natalie. We're nearing the end of our time, but I want to give Morgan and Joe a chance to jump in if you have anything to add.
I'll just add one point really briefly. I mean, I absolutely agree with what has been said by Natalie and Lindsay just now on these points. I think ultimately there needs to be oversight and accountability that means that companies are accountable for harms produced by the optimization decisions made by their algorithmic systems, whether that's ad targeting, ad delivery, or the engagement and kind of personalization algorithms on the platforms. And I think transparency, we need transparency in order to be able to know what those outcomes are, and then but fundamentally the only way that we're really going to shift this is for the companies to be held legally accountable when they there are human rights harms directly linked to the operations of their systems.
Great, thanks, Joe. So we're now nearing the end of our time. Thank you so much to everyone for joining today's event. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope you found this conversation productive and helpful, and be on the lookout for future work that I'm sure all of us will be doing in this space. This event will be on YouTube if you'd like to access a recording afterwards. And yeah, thank you and enjoy your day.